Okay, so now that we've made it through the Americas, notice the first three modules covered North America, Middle America, and South America. Now we're getting to Europe, getting to what is generally referred to as the Old World, from which the New World was colonized. Older editions of this textbook actually went the opposite direction, or a different order. They actually covered Europe first, and then got around to the Americas. But this new edition, the 17th edition, does cover the Americas first. But let's keep in mind that, yeah, the Americas wouldn't have been populated, at least in the indigenous populations, but the composition of the population that we know of wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the Europeans exploring and discovering the New World. So keep that in mind, because Europe now is, if you think about America as being a fairly young experiment, Europe is a much older experiment in generally democracy. Most of European countries are democracies. And so it's interesting to see how those European countries using that democratic model are more evolved than America, in the sense that America just hasn't had that much time to go through the different stages of democracy and capitalism. So it's kind of interesting to get a chance to see Europe as being a slightly more developed or more evolved version of the experiment we are currently carrying on in America. Hopefully on the previous slide you can appreciate the interesting geography of Europe. The fact that it's made up of islands and all kinds of crazy peninsulas, very unusual coastlines, and on the western boundary, it's pretty clear as to where the boundaries are. You run into the North Sea, or you run into the Mediterranean Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean. It's pretty clear cut. But on the eastern side, notice that, where does Europe end and where does Russia begin? There's no clear geographic boundary there. There's no river, for example, that essentially defines and cuts off Europe from Russia. So that's why it becomes a lot more fuzzy on the eastern side. The boundaries are rather fuzzy and dynamic, as described on this slide. So again, never hesitate to ask, why is geography important? Well, geography is important because location on the Earth, as well as the terrain, can affect your climate. Obviously, the farther north you are, the farther you are away from the tropics, the colder it is, the tougher it is to grow crops, etc., etc. So geography quite often determines your climate. Your climate determines your agriculture. And quite often agriculture, the ability to feed your people, affects your economy. Also, what affects your economy are resources. So kind of the two elements, agriculture and resources, quite often are very important. Resources drive industry. Whether you have a lot of natural resources to create energy, if you have a lot of coal or oil or whatever, that affects your economy, as does agriculture. So geography is really crucial in understanding the economy of a country. On the last slide and on the next one, you'll see the varied climates that Europe has, and it is quite various. You have some very warm, humid climates, such as along the Mediterranean. Then you have some really cold and dry climates further inland. Now, Europe would be in really kind of a much different position economically if it weren't for the North Atlantic Current. And this is actually a graphic that I did years ago when I worked for USA Today. And it just goes to show that the Gulf Stream, this flow of warm water that flows northward into the North Atlantic, has a huge impact on Northern Europe in particular. Parts of England would not be as warm, as temperate as they are, if it weren't for the fact that they were constantly getting these warm waters and therefore warm breezes off of the Atlantic Ocean. And that's one concern in a changing world with global climate change. One thing that scientists are concerned about is the fact that Greenland, which is just up here, has a lot of water locked up in its ice sheet. If that, in a warming world, if that ice sheet melts, you're going to have a large intrusion of fresh water into the North Atlantic. And the question is, what will that do to the Gulf Stream? If the North Atlantic Current is affected by this infusion of fresh water, what kind of impacts might that have on the climate of Europe? And as we just discussed, climate is very important when it comes to agriculture and driving the overall economy. So again, these are important topics. These are things that we need to think about as we start to ponder what the future world may look like. There's very little I can add to this this slide, apart from to tell you that, of course, these different areas, these different physiographic units are described on page 45 of your book, and you may find it interesting to kind of flip back and forth from page 45 to page 49 to see where, because on page 49 there's a map of the European population distribution, and see where the populations live with respect to these different physiographic regions. Notice especially where the mountain systems are. Do you notice that the mountain systems appear to be kind of natural barriers from that keep populated areas from other populated areas? It's tough to live at high elevation. And so you notice that you do see some of these, I can see them particularly in the Alps here. Notice where the Alps are, and notice that on the population map, yeah, there's kind of a dearth of people in that region. You have a lot of population in the foothills. You have a lot of population in the foothills of Italy, as well as in the some of the lower elevations of Austria and Switzerland, etc. But actually in the high altitudes of the Alps, not a whole lot of population. From this map, it's pretty clear as to why Europe developed so early and why major civilizations developed early in this region. Excuse me. Look at all the access to water. Back in the day, the only way you could transport goods long distances was either over land, which was relatively inefficient, without roads, without the internal combustion engine. But the easier way was to use the sea. And notice that Europe had plenty of access, not only with rivers, but also, of course, ports. Now in modern day times, we have highways, we have trucks and such, but we also have airplanes. And notice that even though Europe seems very far away from, say, America, especially with airplanes, you can take a pretty quick and short route. It's called a polar route that makes travel between the continents relatively easy, relatively quick. And the Greek and Roman empires, and how those two civilizations changed over time. Infrastructure was developed across Europe, and that, of course, changed how people lived. So, pay attention to how agriculture changed. Pay attention to how population shifted and how languages changed during this time period. Another very important topic that's mentioned in this section is specialization, how people's work changed. Certain areas specialized in doing certain things, quite often depending upon what crops they were growing in that region or what natural resources were available. And this became even more marked when the Industrial Revolution rolled around in the 19th century. Okay, so check out that line. Industrial Revolution created industrial transformation of agrarian Europe. Let that really sink in. What does all that mean? What was the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution was essentially a realization that you could use natural resources, could be water, turning a water wheel, or it could be the burning of coal to heat water, to create steam, and harnessing that pressurized steam to drive pistons that would make things go, steam engines to be used to make a locomotive move, or to create a tractor or something of the sort. It was a realization that you could use natural resources to do work, human work, that previously had been that required a lot of people to do or required animals to do. And so this did change how agriculture was done. It transformed agriculture. It lessened the requirement of human capital in farming. And of course, that forced people to force farmers to look for other work, and therefore they had to move into cities. And of course, cities were transforming as well, because then you started with industrial revolution and with automation, you started to have machines that would start making textiles and such. You had now a way of creating factories, and those factories needed people. And so you have this shift of people from the countryside to these cities. So yes, the Industrial Revolution transformed what had been a very agrarian Europe. And you can see how that spread of industrialization occurred starting in the early to mid 19th century and then continuing on into the later 19th century, generally moving from west to east. With industrialization came greater urbanization, as we've already discussed, people moving from the countryside to the cities. You're having more concentrated population areas, and you can see that in this map. You can see how these clusters of red indicate that people will start to move to common locations, because that's where the products were being produced, that's where products were available. You also had a population explosion. Life expectancies were increasing. The civilization was creating more food. People were better fed. They were living longer, having more children, etc. So you have this move toward urbanization, as well as an increase in population that was tied in with the Industrial Revolution. Along with the Industrial Revolution, during the same time period, and even kind of leading into the Industrial Revolution, there was also a political revolution going on, where you were having more defined countries. First of all, boundaries were starting to be established. They mentioned the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 in developing and evolving Europe's states, but also you had the decrease in the absolutist states. Absolutist states are described as ones that are essentially ruled by a monarch, in which the people had very few rights, and that system was falling apart, and a more quote-unquote democratic system was replacing it. Of course, not just democracy, but socialism, was also developing as well. But essentially, more power was being passed along to the people in politics. So it's a good question to ask yourself. What does it mean to be diverse? What is diversity? And how does diversity develop? Why do we have, if you look at this map, all these different languages? How did that happen? So it's a relatively interesting thing to ponder. And one thing you must realize is that back in the days when languages were being developed, people didn't move around very much. They essentially did not travel hundreds of miles during the course of their lifetime. They generally stayed in their immediate vicinity and got to know a relatively small number of people during their lives. And so you can have this sort of isolation that allows for the development of various languages. Now, as the Industrial Revolution progressed and there was more competition for resources, there was more travel, there was more commerce, you have a clash to a certain extent, or you had various languages, people who speak different languages having to deal with each other. And of course, in addition to languages, you also had various religions developing in certain regions that for a long time had been very isolated, and now we're starting to come into contact with the people who thought in other ways. And so that challenge continues to the present day. How do you deal with people who speak different languages, who hold different beliefs, if they have to interact, if they have to live in the same location? And here's another good comparison. Remember, we looked at the population density map earlier, as well as the climate map and the physiography or the mountain chain map earlier. Now we're going to do the same thing. Kind of take a look at these maps and notice, you notice that there's any relationship between, say, the physical geography or the physiography of Europe and the languages that you see distributed across the continent. If you think about infrastructure and how infrastructure, roads, vehicles that we use for transportation, how those developed with the Industrial Revolution, how that then connected parts of Europe that otherwise had been physically separated. At one time there were certain things that were physical barriers, whether it was rivers, whether it was mountains, but now with modern transportation and with good roadways and all these, this allowed for regions to cooperate and to transfer goods that hadn't been able to up until then. So you have these ideas of complementarity and transferability. The fact that if you, depending on the resources that are available in your area or perhaps your climate in your area, you might be able to grow something in particular. In France, you might be able to grow wine grapes much better than you can in Norway. But Norwegians like wine, and so now France is producing something that Norwegians want. And so you have this complementarity, so that now you can actually develop an economy. France can produce something that Norwegians can now purchase. And the ability for that purchase or for that transaction to go on depends upon the transferability. How easily is it to move wine from France to Norway? Is it better to produce the finished product in France, or do you just ship the grapes off to Norway and maybe they can make the wine there? So these are new terms that are very important to understanding the economy of Europe. Well, I've never been to Europe, and in fact, I've generally lived in mostly rural and suburban areas most of my life. Europe is very interesting in that it has population density that's unlike that here in America. A lot of cities, and therefore that's why you have an infrastructure in Europe that really is catered to cities and city living. Notice there's a lot more public transportation in Europe. Fewer people actually own their own vehicles. More people travel by train or bus, and there are great train systems set up because of that. So it's kind of a different way of life than it is here in America, because so much focus is on city living and metropolises. Europe has had what's called negative population growth, or at least portions of Europe have experienced negative population growth, and that becomes a problem, especially in modern times where we have social programs that depend upon taxpayer money, where essentially you're allowing for benefits for older people, assuming that you've got younger people in the workforce who are going to be paying for those benefits. And the problem occurs when you start to have kind of an upside down pyramid, where when you have more people needing benefits on the older end of the age spectrum and fewer people in the workforce, fewer younger people in the workforce actually kicking in tax dollars to pay for those benefits. So you need to have a constant supply of newer, younger people in the workforce. And if you are not naturally doing that through actually having children, you need to increase your population another way, which is by immigration. But there become problems when you have a lot of immigrants, because now you start to have issues with national identity or even continental European identity, because you have new people coming in who do speak different languages, have different beliefs. And the question is, what do you do? How do you handle an influx of new people? So that's actually a huge challenge in Europe. It's actually the topic for your discussion board for Module 1 as well. I'm a physical science guy myself. That's where my area of expertise is. So centrifugal is that idea. Centrifugal force is the sometimes called a fake force. But if you ever drive in a car, if you're in the passenger seat, let's say, and you're in the passenger seat and you go around a sharp left turn, you feel like you're being thrown against the door, don't you? Especially if you're not wearing a seatbelt. There seems to be a force that is causing you to be thrown outward away from the car. And it's only because the car door is there that you're actually kept with the car and you actually make the curve with the car. So that's centrifugal. It's kind of a force that appears to give you outward motion. Centripetal means center seeking. So for example, if you have a rock on a string and you loop it around, you loop the string around the rock and you twirl the rock around your head, your overhead in a nice circle, you'll feel tension in the string because it's the tension of the string that actually causes the rock to stay in its circular path. So there's a centripetal force there, a center-seeking force. There's a force of the string on the rock that causes the rock to move in a circular motion. Otherwise, if you just snip the string, the rock would go flying off in a straight line, wouldn't it? So there's a centripetal, a force toward the center called centripetal that is at work there. So use those analogies perhaps as a way of remembering these centrifugal forces. That's to break up, to go outward, versus centripetal, center-seeking, staying close. Okay, because again, you'll be seeing these terms again in your future reading. European Union, the EU, and and why did it come about, and what have been the challenges, who's part of it, and what's the future for the EU? Now, why did it come about? I think there was the general recognition that European countries are relatively small on the world scale, when taken as just individuals, but there's also the recognition that there's a lot of interplay between the different countries because they're so darn close, and they trade with each other quite a bit. And so if they bond together, if they create a union, they can more effectively compete on the world stage with larger countries such as the United States, and now in more modern times, China. And it's very much like a union of workers in the United States. One individual worker who wants more rights or wants more clout can't really do it on his own. But if he can convince others to join with him and have the threat for a strike, if they don't get their demands, they're more likely to have clout, they're more likely to have political power. And so that is the motive for the European Union. Another motive that was mentioned in the, the previous slide was just the need to become cohesive after a really jarring World War II, where you really did a number on Europe and its cities. So there was a need for peace, a need for cooperation, a need for cohesion, which also helped to spawn the EU. Now notice that the EU was not just created in one fell swoop. There was original members that were the ones that are in pink, Germany and France and Italy, etc. Then you had several expansions over time, one in 1958 and the most recent being in, it looks like 2013. Okay, so what are some of the benefits of unification? Well, first of all, it does, by having agreements between the different countries, makes it a lot easier for commerce to occur. There's fewer barriers along borders. You don't have to have a passport every time you want to go from one country to the next. You don't have to check in at customs and that sort of thing. So it's a lot easier to have commerce between the countries. And another step along that path was to institute a single currency instead of having to, every time you do business, if you go from France to Belgium, you don't have to go and turn all your francs into whatever they use in Belgium, you don't need to exchange currency. You can just use one single currency, the euro, which is recognized and valid in various countries. Pros and cons of the EU. And one of the pros is that you have a reduced effect of national boundaries. And that's important, especially in Europe, which was home to 2 world wars in the 20th century, that nationalism isn't quite so big a thing. Some of the challenges is the subsidies, and the fact that, as is mentioned on page 57, that some of the more well-to-do countries wind up having to subsidize some of the less prosperous countries. And there's also issues with the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, and subsidies given to farmers. Again, once you start dealing with subsidies, you start getting a lot of politics involved. You know, so who do you subsidize? Do you subsidize grape growers in France, or do you subsidize wheat farmers in Germany? So you start getting a lot of people feeling perhaps put out that they didn't benefit when they feel like they should have. So there's issues there, and that sometimes will allow for new differences to develop between member states, or even exacerbate existing differences between member states. Devolution, and again, this is described as a centrifugal force, kind of a tearing apart force. Think about even in the U.S.'s history, centrifugal or devolution that's occurred. Think back to the Civil War. The fact that you had a region, entire region of the country, that felt that they were not being listened to, that they were not being served by being part of the larger country. And they actually, there was a civil war that developed. They actually seceded and became their own country. That's a devolution taken to an extreme, but this is where civil wars sometimes result from, is this idea that a certain region is not being served by the state that it exists in, and they want more autonomy. They want to be able to rule themselves. And the question is, well, what does the state do? Does the state accommodate and try to address some of those concerns, or do you wind up in a civil war? There's a whole section on the choices that the EU has to make going forward. It's been a rough decade for the EU with financial crisis and immigration and all this kind of stuff. And there are still people who are very pro EU. The EU has brought about a lot of prosperity in a lot of locations. And so if you're pro, certainly if you're con, you probably don't want to widen or deepen the EU. But if you're pro, there are questions as to, well, do you continue to expand? Do you add more and more countries to the EU? If it's been working out great, then perhaps the more the merrier. And should you deepen the policies of the EU? Should you give the EU more power? Decrease the power of the individual nations and increase the power of the centralized system called the EU. That there's another organization that is used to unify Europe. It's called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this one has to do more with a common defense than it does about a common economy. But there's still issues with NATO in current days as to whether it should expand, what its role in keeping the peace in Europe and abroad is, and so again, a lot of challenges when it comes to NATO as well as when it comes to the EU. Important feature is this dashed red line. As you'll notice, what defines what's called the European core versus the periphery. The core is essentially those areas that are the economic drivers of Europe. So if you're within that region, and notice that it doesn't just follow country borders. For example, Italy is essentially cut right down the middle, with the northern half being a much larger economic driver than the southern half of Italy. And with that economic power comes political power. So those are the areas that really have the most political power. The poorer areas, the less productive areas, don't have quite as much pull when it comes to political influence. I strongly encourage you to use all the tools at your disposal, and one of the tools that's available here in Chapter 1B is a little website that shows you a lot about Europe's microstates. And so if you go to the website, you click on that link, click on the box, you'll be able to access some videos here. Kind of a general introduction to the idea of microstates, and then there's actually kind of little quizzes about the locations of these microstates. So for an example, Andorra is down here, and you can kind of place them. And let's see, Vatican City, Liechtenstein, and we submit that, and we do great. And we can there's several different sections. You can learn about all the different countries, and I'll take you to a video that explains a little bit more about that particular location. And then there's a conclusion. So it's a neat little extra thrown in there, and I highly encourage you to make use of those when they are available. Okay, so this slide defines what's called the mainland core. Now, why is it called mainland? Because this is part of essentially what is continental Europe. If you ever hear the term continental Europe, it's part of the larger landmass, the European continent, not to be confused with, say, the British Isles. That's the United Kingdom or Britain, however you want to call it, is an island. It's not part of the mainland. And of course, you also have the Scandinavian peninsula up here, but again, that's not part of the main part of the European continent. So when you mention the mainland, this is what we're talking about. And then the mainland core are those core countries, those economically powerful countries that are included in here, which includes, of course, Germany and France, and then Benelux through here. Netherlands, Brussels, or Belgium, and Luxembourg. And then you have the Czech Republic, Austria, Switzerland. Notice that because Italy is divided, it's half of Italy is part of the core and half of Italy is not part of the core, so therefore it's not truly a part of the mainland core here. Twice during the 20th century, Germany was the provocateur of world wars, and back then, as a result of the Second World War, Germany was divided into eastern and western halves. And since the late 20th century, Germany has been reunified, and now is the largest economy in Europe, and really is has the biggest clout when it comes to the EU. Here you can see the former border between East and West Germany, that red line down through there. So the former East Germany is still languishing from the kind of the hangover of communist rule. Population is much poorer. There's less prosperity in the former East Germany compared to the former West Germany. I encourage you to watch this video. This is about Turkish citizens who moved to Germany after World War II as a way of helping rebuild the country, and have remained. And that's a very interesting video, especially as you see as generations go on, particularly among children, how some of these big differences in ethnicities, languages, and cultures start to fade away generation after generation because, after all, we're all just human beings. The author does a really nice job of going into the attributes of France. France is, again, one of those mainland core countries. It's actually bigger than Germany, but it's not the same economic driver that Germany is. And part of that has to do with some of the natural resources. It has to do with the physiography of France, the fact that it doesn't really have a good deep water port, and also just the governance and the layout, the political layout of France, in the sense that it's got one main city, Paris, and Germany is much more dispersed. It's got not a large main city, but it's got a lot more kind of medium-sized cities. Much of France's global cultural impact results from Paris. In fact, as is mentioned in the book, when France was colonial, when it set up different colonies, it tried to export its Parisian culture, even in those far-flung places. And Paris remains a huge cultural exporter when it comes to fashion, uh, literature, film, art. Um, the French have a huge impact on global culture. Now, one challenge that Paris is facing, as is going to be a common theme in this chapter, is especially in the cities, the influx of immigrants and how those new arrivals are able to assimilate into the existing culture. Part of the improvements to the French economy is an effort to decentralize, to become a little less centered on Paris, and to um, give a little more power to other autonomous regions. Again, one of the problems in France is population. The fact that there's a natural negative population growth, and so therefore there's a need for new workers, but the new workers are coming from immigrants, and that poses its own problem, well, culturally, educationally, et cetera, et cetera. These two side-by-side maps, it's a good way to assess the disparity between Germany and France as far as economic power. Notice the GDP per capita in France. You have your one real highlight. In Paris, the GDP per capita is over 30,000. Say in Germany, a much larger area has that same color. So notice that the fact that you have many kind of mid-sized cities where there's a certain amount of affluence and prosperity in Germany compared to that one location in France. So you can see that overall Germany is a much bigger player in the world economic stage than France is. Okay, so tucked just to the north of France and to the west of Germany is the Benelux region, which includes Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg. Luxembourg really benefited from kind of post-World War II realignments, and now has the world's largest per capita income. The Alpine states, which include with Switzerland, Austria, and the Czech Republic. Um, this is where the Alps kind of run through, and it makes a very interesting point about the fact that Switzerland is politically neutral and economically prosperous compared to the much larger Austria to its east. Okay, so we've already talked about the mainland core of Europe. Now we're talking about the core offshore. Remember that red dashed line indicates the European core, which does include much of the British Isles, with the really exception of really northern Scotland and far western Ireland. But for the most part, the British Isles are included in the European core. The British Isles have been kind of home to a lot of conflict, not war conflict, but economic conflict. With Scotland perhaps leaving the United Kingdom at one point, or at least some motion toward that. That motion was voted down, and of course the UK voting to leave the European Union, the Brexit vote that recently occurred. So there's been a lot of on again, off again unity with the European Union. Of course, the UK did not adopt the euro when it was introduced, so still a lot of interest as far as what's going to happen to the economy of the British Isles going forward after exiting the European Union. The book alludes a little bit to the past glory of the British Empire. There used to be the saying that the sun never would set on the British Empire because British holdings were so far flung and distributed around the globe. Britain at one time, or England at one time, was a real world military, political, and economic superpower. Its reach is not that great anymore, but it's still a significant economic power, at least in Europe, and that's why its decision to leave the EU does leave things a bit in a bit of a bind. But of course, as we mentioned, the UK is actually made up of 4 regions. You've got England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. So there's Northern Ireland right there. Ireland itself is a separate country, and there are big religious divisions there between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Ireland is primarily Catholic. Northern Ireland is primarily Protestant, and that's why it's aligned with the rest of the UK. But even within Northern Ireland, there's still a large Catholic population, and for decades there have been ongoing battles and strife between those two communities. When we were talking about the mainland core, we did not include Italy. The reason being, even though Italy is part of continental Europe, it's divided as far as its economic productivity. There's actually the Ancona line, kind of a line that goes from Ancona down through Rome, dividing the more productive, more prosperous northern half of the country with the less prosperous southern half of the country. As is common in Europe, Spain has a kind of tumultuous political and economic history. The book mentions the authoritarian regime of Francisco Franco for many decades, and even in modern days, there's still a lot of instability in Spain, largely due to economic struggles. And Spain is one of those countries that has had to get bailouts from the EU. Unemployment is still a major problem. Differences in productivity. Notice that again, there's that red line that divides the core region from the periphery. In southern Spain, for climate reasons and agricultural reasons, is just not as productive as the northern part of Spain. So those disparities lead to political unrest and unemployment and that sort of thing. So also on the what's called the Iberian Peninsula. Again, the Iberian Peninsula is the peninsula that includes Spain as well as Portugal. So notice Portugal is much smaller than Spain is, but Portugal at one time was, of course, a seafaring power because it had great access to the ocean Gosh, Christopher Columbus went to the king and queen of Portugal to fund his transatlantic voyage. So Portugal, not nearly as powerful as it at one time was. The other state that's mentioned on this particular slide, it's very tough to see down here, but there it is, Malta. And this is kind of the blown up version. This little square here shows you Malta. Again, it's a island nation. It's an archipelago of, I think it's 5 islands. 3 of them are not populated, but 2 of them do have people living on them. And it's out in the Mediterranean, just to the south of Sicily. Fairly good economy in Malta, largely due to the tourist industry. Okay, the world economic downturn of 2007, 2008, 2009 really hit Greece hard, and it is still yet to recover. It required several rounds of bailouts from the EU, which that decision, of course, caused a lot of consternation in Germany and actually has made Germany somewhat politically unstable because of decisions to bail out struggling economies such as Spain and Greece. The Balkans are certainly a war-torn part of Europe. A lot of Europe has seen a lot of war, not just in the 20th century, but throughout the centuries. But nowhere, perhaps, has it been bloodier than what is typically called the Balkans, this region and through here. Bosnia, Serbia, Macedonia, Croatia, appropriately called a shatter belt because there are so many languages, cultures, no real good way of defining borders and boundaries, various religions. There's just too many devolutionary forces and too many centrifugal forces to keep a lot of stability in this region. I should have mentioned it's actually mentioned in the previous slide, but the term Balkanized, you may have heard of that before. That comes from this particular region that is, again, it's a shatter belt. To be Balkanized means essentially you have to agree to disagree, or you wind up, kind of in your own echo chambers. There's very little way of conversing when 2 people are Balkanized. That means they hold such differing viewpoints that there's very little hope for certainly agreement, but even any kind of conversation. That's what the term Balkanized means, and that's where it comes from, this particular region of Europe. Describes some of the ethnic cleansing that occurred in this region, especially when Yugoslavia collapsed back in the 1990s, and it became a bloodbath. It's estimated that up to about 250,000 people perished in concentration camps, and the world did very little to intervene. Okay, so now we go from south to north of Europe, and we're seeing the Scandinavian peninsula as well as Iceland, which is out there in the North Atlantic. And again, there's that red line indicating the core versus the periphery. So you can see that not all of Scandinavia is part of the core of Europe. Only the southern portions of Norway, Sweden, and Finland are part of the core. Denmark is part of the core. Iceland is considered a periphery country, as well as we're going to talk about, the Baltic states here are periphery countries. But as far as the Scandinavian countries go, it's pretty clear that the climate gets very inhospitable very quickly. We're getting to such large latitudes. We're getting so close to the Arctic Circle that the northern parts of these countries are very sparsely populated. So most of the action, most of the development, most of the prosperity is in the southern portions of these countries. Interesting when it comes to Denmark that it's a very small country compared to some of these giants in Scandinavia, yet it is the second most populous behind Sweden. For Shakespeare fans, if you remember Hamlet, Hamlet was a prince of Denmark. So that kind of puts his location into perspective. Also part of Northern Europe are the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Now these were all at one time part of what we now call Russia, but back in the day before the USSR collapsed, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were part of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Again, I encourage you to watch these supplemental videos. This particular one is about a ethnic group in Estonia called the Setu, and how when the USSR broke up and Estonia became an independent nation, when a border was set up, the Setu, some of their roots are still in Russia. And especially important to them are their ancestors and visiting burial places, and a lot of them cannot go back to Russia to visit their ancestors, which is part of their very important part of their culture, because of the border and needing to apply for a visa just to be able to go what amounts to be a matter of miles. Our last stop in the north is Iceland. Remember, Iceland is an island nation in the North Atlantic. In fact, it lies right along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is an area at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean where new crust is being formed, and actually the Atlantic Ocean is getting larger every year. And because of its position along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, Iceland is a very volcanically active and geothermically active country. When the USSR was intact and the Cold War was still going on, of course, there was NATO, there was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for essentially the western part of Europe and for the US and such. And then the other organization on the other side was what was called the Warsaw Pact, which included the USSR. It also included Poland. But since the demise of the USSR, Poland has started to reach out economically and politically with Western Europe more than it has with Russia.